Hey everybody, I'm Jack, and this is Raw Tropical Living. Thanks for joining me today. Hope you all had a nice weekend and your week is off to a good start. A little bit out of order this week. I don't like routine anymore. I like to shake routine up, but main reason I didn't do a video on Saturday is because I went down to Pensacola, decided to get out of town for the day, went down to Pensacola, did a few things. I had a beautiful day, and yesterday was just lazy, so did not get around to doing a video until today. That's okay. No routine. Anyhow, today I want to talk about the subject is suffering and happiness are not separate. And this is from the book No Mud, No Lotus by Thich Nhat Hanh. I've talked about him, read from his writings before, but never shared from this book. Actually, this is a new book of his I have on my Kindle. So, if you are not already subscribed to the channel, I'd really appreciate if you go down and hit that big red subscribe button now. Come back and check out some of my content. Might be for you, might not be. You might come back, watch a couple of videos and say, I'll pass on this guy. And that's all right. Alrighty, let's see. Let me get the old iPad ready to go. All right. So suffering and happiness are not separate. When we suffer, we tend to think that suffering is all there is at that moment, and happiness belongs to some other time or place. People often ask, why do I have to suffer? Thinking we should be able to have a life without any suffering is as deluded as thinking we should be able to have a left side without a right side. The same is true of thinking we have a life in which no happiness whatsoever is to be found. If the left says, right, you have to go away. I don't want you. I only want the left. That's nonsense, because then the left would have to stop existing as well. If there's no right, then there's no left. Where there is no suffering, there can be no happiness either, and vice versa. If we can learn to see and skillfully engage with both the presence of happiness and the presence of suffering, we will go in the direction of enjoying life more. Every day we go a little farther in that direction, and eventually we realize that suffering and happiness are not two separate things. Cold air can be painful if you aren't wearing enough warm clothes. But when you're feeling overheated or you're walking outside with proper clothing, the bracing sensation of cold air can be a source of feeling joy and aliveness. Suffering isn't some kind of external objective source of oppression and pain. There might be things that cause you to suffer, such as loud music or bright lights, which may bring other people joy. There are things that bring you joy that annoy other people. The rainy day that ruins your plans for a picnic is a boon for the farmer whose field is parched. Happiness is possible right now, today, but happiness cannot be without suffering. Some people think that in order to be happy, they must avoid all suffering, and so they are constantly vigilant, constantly worrying. They end up sacrificing all their spontaneity, freedom, and joy. This isn't correct. If you can recognize and accept your pain without running away from it, you will discover that although pain is there, joy can also be there at the same time. Some say that suffering is only an illusion, or that to live wisely we have to transcend both suffering and joy. I say the opposite. The way to suffer well and be happy is to stay in touch with what is actually going on. In doing so, you will gain liberating insights into the true nature of suffering and of joy. Both suffering and happiness are of an organic nature, which means they are both transitory. They are always changing. The flower, when it wilts, becomes to compost. The compost can help grow a flower again. Happiness is also organic and impermanent by nature. It can become suffering, and suffering can become happiness again. If you look deeply into a flower, you see that a flower is made only of non-flower elements. In that flower there is a cloud. Of course we know a cloud isn't a flower, but without a cloud, a flower can't be. If there's no cloud, there's no rain, and no flower can grow. You don't have to be a dreamer to see a cloud floating in a flower. It's really there. Sunlight's also there. Sunlight isn't flower, but without sunlight, no flower is possible. If we continue to look deeply into the flower, we see many other things, like the earth and the minerals. Without them, a flower cannot be. So it's a fact that a flower is made only of non-flower elements. A flower can't be by herself alone. A flower can only interbe with everything else. You can't remove the sunlight, the soil, or the cloud from the flower. In each of our Plum Village practice centers around the world, we have a lotus pond. Everyone knows we need to have mud for lotuses to grow. The mud doesn't smell so good, but the lotus flower smells very good. If you don't have mud, the lotus won't manifest. You can't grow lotus flowers on marble. Without mud, there can be no lotus. It is possible, of course, to get stuck in the mud of life. It's easy enough to notice mud all over you at times. The hardest thing to practice is not allowing yourself to be overwhelmed by despair. When you're overwhelmed by despair, all you can see is suffering everywhere you look. You feel as if the worst thing is happening to you. But we must remember that suffering is a kind of mud that we need in order to generate joy and happiness. Without suffering, there's no happiness. So we shouldn't discriminate against the mud. We have to learn how to embrace and cradle our own suffering and the suffering of the world with a lot of tenderness. When I lived in Vietnam during the war, it was difficult to see our way through that dark and heavy mud. It seemed like the destruction would just go on and on forever. Every day people would ask me if I thought the war would end soon. It was very difficult to answer because there was no end in sight. But I knew if I said I don't know, that would only water their seeds of despair. So when people asked me that question, I replied, everything is impermanent, even war. It will end someday. Knowing that, we could continue to work for peace. And indeed, the war did end. Now, the former mortal enemies are busily trading and touring back and forth, and people throughout the world enjoy practicing our traditions, teachings on mindfulness and peace. If you know how to make good use of the mud, you can grow beautiful lotuses. If you know how to make good use of suffering, you can produce happiness. We do need some suffering to make happiness possible. And most of us have enough suffering inside and around us to be able to do that. We don't need to create more. That one's real pertinent, and that, he's like he was my first introduction to this whole mindfulness thing many, many years ago, at least 25 years ago, if not 30 years ago, which, like I say, in recent years has led me into this mindfulness practice. And I'm learning to see things more and more like life as a meditation. When circumstances, things come up, how we perceive them. How we perceive things, there's a saying, I'll butcher it, but it's, what something actually is only 10%, and our perception of it is 90%. So the way we perceive things is so strong. And I see those type things, and I try to always go back to that. I try to remember those things, especially when I'm struggling a little bit, when you do have something happening that could be considered suffering, not to get bogged down in that, and also to realize that that's not all that's going on at the same time. And also, how am I labeling that? A lot of the labeling of me labeling that as suffering even contributes to this. I know it gets kind of deep and convoluted at times, but no, so you just kind of start to accept things. The crux of mindfulness, you just observe and you see things as you are. Oh, this is pleasant. Oh, this is what suffering is. Okay, I accept suffering. Suffering is a part of life. And I don't get too down. And then when I'm very happy, I'm like, okay, this is a part of life. I don't get too excited. But I can definitely relate, last year when I was going through, and it bugged me a lot, and it got in my head a lot, and I'm not completely over it. I think it's something I'm going to feel to some capacity for the rest of my life. But when I had that inflammation in my ribs, that chondrocostal junction syndrome, I remember the name of it now. I just, even though it was bothering me a lot, and I wasn't in a lot of pain, it was annoying me because I couldn't stay still. I couldn't sit in one position for very long. I'd try to work and I'd get stiff. I'd have to get up. I couldn't be comfortable laying down sometimes, this and that, so back and forth. But I always tried to have in my mind focused on that, like, this isn't it. This doesn't just sum up my life at all in total. And I tried to counteract that with gratitude. I would, sometimes I would just lay in bed, and in lieu of actually meditating, just like, I would think, and I would just go through a list of things I was grateful for, and that helped a lot. Thinking, okay, well, I'm dealing with something that's causing me a lot of anxiety, which is also suffering. There's also a lot of good stuff going on. There's a lot of stuff for me to be grateful about. But anyhow, I do, I enjoy. I don't think I've ever read anything by Thich Nhat Hanh that I didn't enjoy, and that's why I enjoy sharing it so much. And like I say, that he's the person that kind of, laid the groundwork that eventually led me to my mindfulness meditation practice. But anyhow, hope you guys enjoyed that one today. If you like it, please give me a thumbs up, and I'll probably see you again in a couple or 3 days. Y'all have a beautiful week. Peace.